especially to us who live in the townships, because we are like the buffer, the first frontier to deal with this situation. Instead of taking a much more pragmatic approach, the established Muslims, unfortunately, have taken an approach which seek to serve and protect their own narrow interests, which is a problem. There is this blanket no to what's going on, instead of engaging constructively with this very, very important socio-political discussion that all of us as South Africans are engaged in. So it serves an interest, particularly the capitalist business interest within the established Muslim communities, which has been a problem. I'm not saying all of them, but the majority of them, and at least some of the statements I've seen, seek to just blindly say no to what's been going on, and again, that's the problem. So today I want to talk about these trappings and how we should deal with this situation as Muslims, particularly the developing Muslims within societies, because it's key on how we deal with this. Number one, I think culturally we have been, and we are guilty of othering. We have decided, for some reasons, to actually embrace a culture that has now become challenged within the Muslim or within the townships from which we come from. And the reason why that's the case is because Islam was given to us from a certain perspective and by certain people. And alhamdulillah, Allah bless them, because they did give us Islam, and that's why we're Muslims today. But what we're seeing happening right now is a backlash, a pushback. We are now the other within our townships, within our families, particularly our women who have got no choice but to look a certain part outside their homes. They are now becoming the other, notwithstanding that they are part and parcel of these societies and township. And this is a challenge that I think all of us need to deal with and look at it in a way that is going to help us survive, but also help us continue propagating Islam within our communities. I've argued, and I'll continue to argue, that our mothers and cousins who are not Muslims have always observed hijab. They might not necessarily have been dressing in black, but have always observed hijab. And as a result, there's never been a problem between them and the other, because it's part and parcel of our culture. And I'll also be self-critical that what we did, on the other hand, as African Muslims within these cultures within which we live, we've decided to create this other within by the way we look, by the way we understand, and the way we practice hijab. And that has created a problem. By the way we, as men, also in Islam, portray, look, and seek to identify or create a separate identity within the communities within which we live. Now, these are desperate times which require desperate thinking in terms of how we move henceforth. And I'm of the view, and I've had this discussion Allah accept her, inshallah she passed on, and my daughters, on how my daughters were supposed to dress up as Muslims who are Zulu, who are South Africans, who interact with their cousins in the townships. And we came to a decision, because most of the time they felt excluded when they're in the townships, but they also felt excluded when they're with the established Muslims in South Africa. So we came up with a deal that they will observe hijab, but that hijab is not supposed to alienate them. In other words, they will look like their cousins without necessarily pronouncing their so-called Islam, because looking like most women and men look does not necessarily mean that you're Muslim. You just happen to embrace a culture which is predominantly practiced by others. But hijab is hijab. So if you go, for example, for some of us who have a chance, whether in Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, the Gulf, India, Pakistan, various forms of hijab. But all of it, the main purpose is about us looking modest and covering ourselves without othering, without creating a position where we start being pointed out as different. And as a result, being targeted for looking different. Right now we have a political situation and a threat. And again, most of the men in this room can be mistaken for anything. But it's our women who are always vulnerable. And I think it's important for us to have this discussion openly. I mean, I can go anywhere, like after this I'm going to a funeral. Nobody will tell whether I'm Muslim or not. But we expect our women to look a certain part, notwithstanding that their fellow counterparts in South Africa are already observing hijab in a different way. So I'm of the view that this whole situation and social political challenge that we're facing, it's not going to stop anytime soon. Our women are going to be largely targeted because of how they dress up or because of how they observe the hijab. Now, what's the solution? And again, we have to be revolutionary in our thinking. I think our solution needs to go back to the drawing board and look at our mothers and our grandmothers, how they used to dress. They were observing hijab. So we don't have to necessarily look Asian for us to articulate our Islam. We're already Muslims. We live within people who are observing hijab. And we should try and not create the other or othering ourselves by looking foreign within these very antagonistic communities that we are likely to find ourselves. You are likely to explain your position after something happened to you. So my call to the leadership and to all of us is, let us go and have a discussion with our families on how we redefine hijab and how we should look. Because we like it or not, we are in trouble. And it's going to be for some time. And it's not because we are targeted or because we're guilty, but because we ourselves have decided to choose to be the others within our societies and communities. I mean, I know, for example, there are certain other aspects of our culture which are evolving. Like, we have nasheed, for example, in this masjid. That is the Zulu nasheed, when the youngsters are saying they should nasheed in Zulu. Sometimes we eat pap outside. And I'm not saying we are anti the established cultures and tradition, but I don't think there's anything wrong with us continuing with that tradition of trying to redefine who we are amidst the challenges and social political challenges that we're facing. And the discussion might be, we might as men be reluctant to have this discussion, as I've said, because we are protected. We can decide to look any other how, but our women are not. And it's us who insist on this definition of what hijab is. So maybe we should also allow women to begin to have these discussions amongst themselves. What does it mean to be Muslims in Soweto? And what are the political repercussions of othering? It doesn't mean that if you dress in a certain way, you are likely to go to Jannah. But it's important for us to observe hijab. But that hijab has to be defined by people who are impacted by that hijab. It's not supposed to be us as men who don't understand the social, cultural, and political challenges that women are facing at the market, Jabulani Mall, and all other places. It's not us who are supposed to define it anymore. Let them define it themselves, and let them come up with suggestions that are going to be protective and comfortable for them. And again, I've argued that there is nothing wrong with the current hijab that we observe from our aunt and aunties in the township at the moment. It's purely acceptable as part of hijab. We don't have to insist on looking like the other established Muslims for us to say and comfortably feel like we're Muslims. I think I've belingered the point and I've made the point. So the challenge is, or the suggestion I have is, I think women must also have these discussions amongst themselves. And they must be allowed to speak amongst themselves. This is the dialogue. And this dialogue is likely to benefit all of us and our kids in future, that this generation faced this challenge, and this is what they came up with. And it's something that's worth talking about. without compromising our position. So perhaps a discussion amongst our women folk is long overdue and is going to happen. The other point which I think is very important to mention is we need to define what's our interest. And our interest, of course, will be incorporated into the bigger national interest and Muslim interest. But what is our interest as Muslims in Soweto? That's where it starts. What is it that we'd like to see as Muslims in Soweto? We have to define it point by point and work towards achieving it. At the moment, we don't have an interest. You know, we, whenever are challenged by certain situations, we jump into a bandwagon. But what is our challenge? And I'll argue that our challenge is to widen the doors of the masjids and the masajids in Soweto and our communities, is to continue interacting and create stronger bonds and relationship and understanding with our cousins, the relatives who are Catholics and who are Zion Christian Church and all of that. And that is, amongst other things, our interest. Because if we strengthen them, we open them to come and see what we're doing, them understanding that we're not foreigners in our own country, that we eat the way they eat, we sing the way they sing. The politics will change and the interaction between ourselves and our immediate and proximate neighbors that we have in these townships will change. So the widening of the doors of the masjid or masajids, the invitations of the other who live with us within this township to come to the masajids and speak to us, and we speak to them and exchange its cultures, and eventually normalizing the so-called the religion of the established is very important. And you have to start immediately. There's no time. Because there are elements that would like to see this intra-conflict perpetuated, but importantly, the isolation of Muslims and the targeting thereof after the isolation. So we need to be sharper in terms of how we deal with this possible challenge that's coming our way. So our interest is to make sure that we are good neighbors and we promote good neighborliness, but that can only happen if we widen the doors of the masjid. So the interest is very important for us to establish. Who we are, what we're all about, and how to want to see those interests promoted within our environments. But importantly, of course, avoiding this othering, which most of the time some of us can't help it, but we would like to perpetuate for no reason. So that's another point which I think is important, and I would like to share with you in this discussion. The other one which I think is key and important is that we can't continue to be a one foreign policy community. Muslims are only interested in Palestine. If it's not Palestine, they are not interested that much in terms of international relations. And now we are realizing that those formations that have been pro-Palestine, some of them are reluctant in terms of supporting this multiculturalism and multiracialism that all of us supported. And those that have been anti-Palestine and supporting this brutal and genocidal regime of Israel seem to be agitating towards non-racialism, multiculturalism, and we're quite vocal, of course, conveniently so, in protecting, for example, our brothers who have found themselves in some refugee camps, particularly in Durban, for example. Now, I'm not saying it's correct or incorrect. All I'm saying is that our view on foreign relations have to expand. We can't just blanketly support anything that supports Palestine. Anything that doesn't support Palestine, we write it off. Because our interests and our foreign interests have since diversified. You are likely now to find political alliances with people who did not necessarily support Palestine, but will support the proliferation of the masajids and the protection of Muslims, whatever it is. And this has been the mistake that has been made by established Muslims. We're all channeled toward one direction because we have not had our national interests. Our national interests have been blinded by foreign positions. So we need to begin to look at the diversification of our alliances with all political parties and formations in South Africa based on our interests. So after we identify and detail what our interests are, we need to have these piecemeal relationships and foreign policy positions with everyone. Because we can't just put all our eggs in one basket. And we continually are disappointed by this position of just supporting anything that's got to do with Palestine, but does not really support our other interests. So it is urgent for us to look at our interests first as Sowetans and as people living in the township. What is it that we want to see? And that interest will determine our relationship with whoever supports those interests. But the trapping is we cannot continue having this blanket foreign and local political relations based on one issue. It doesn't work like that anymore. We need to change our views. We have interests. One of our interests, for example, is to proliferate business and economic activity in Soweto. Who's going to help us in doing that? And that relationship will determine future interaction with us. But we have been piggybacking on the established Muslim foreign policy position and forgetting our own interest. And that's what we need to start doing. And I don't see any contradictions, by the way. I'm not saying we're going to start fighting. I'm saying the same thing when I meet established Muslim formations about the need for us to diversify our interests. And that interest will then establish relationship that we might have with various people. The other issue that we need to talk about is that our conflicts and solidarity movements around the world have made us proximate and closer to the other. And the other now wants us to lead. In other words, the other liked what they see, and now we're in a position where we are being asked to lead. Case in point, Zohran Mamdani in New York. Case in point, Mr. Yusuf Qasim, who's just been appointed to be the Deputy Minister of Higher. So Muslims are now requested to lead because of the proximity that we've had with the others. So they like what they see. Now, chances are they're going to elect you at the SRC platforms. They're going to elect you to lead them everywhere else because they just believe. Now, here's the question. Are we ready to lead this diverse, new, multicultural society? Or are we going to stick to our guns and remain Muslims as defined and described traditionally by the established Muslims in this country? I think we're facing some serious challenges because they are going to come to us, right? I see it happening all the time. If you look at universities, for example, the number of Muslims that are leading non-Muslim formations or multicultural formations, whether it's Wits University, Stellenbosch University, wherever you go, on a daily basis is increasing. But are we ready for it? Are we ready to redefine what leadership is in a multicultural society? And it's going to happen as well in Soweto. We are fortunate enough in this masjid to have the former mayor of Johannesburg. Same challenge. You know, he was the best man for the job and he had to lead, notwithstanding his principles as a Muslim. So how do you deal with that challenge that's coming our way very fast? And this is why we need contribution of elders and educated people amongst ourselves to prepare us for this thing that's coming our way. Because if we don't, again, we will be victims of the othering. And we'll remain Muslims in Soweto and Muslim within the Muslim community, and that's it. And I think this particular moment in time is calling for us to really rethink our politics and rethink how we deal with society in general. And it will take some kind of revolution for us to deal with this situation. Finally, I touched on it earlier on, but I think it's also important to think about. For the first time, we see the established Muslims, remember my definition of what established, well, at least Isa al-Sepi's definition of what established Muslims were. For the first time, we're seeing the established Muslims on a back foot. And the developing Muslims are suddenly about to call the shots. But how do you deal with that situation? And what has led us to this situation is the current protests. The current protest has given us some political capital as developing Muslims. We are now suddenly, more than ever before, called upon to meetings to deal with these new challenges. But unfortunately, we're not coherent when we go to those meetings. We still allow ourselves to be incorporated into the bigger thought because we don't want to shake or rock the boat. But I think it's time for us to rock the boat in terms of new thinking and understanding of what socio-political realities are supposed to be. So we face, and this of course is a discussion amongst friends, and it's not meant in any way or form to alienate or imply anything. It's just a discussion, and it's open discussion amongst friends, and all of us need to really seriously think about it. The established Muslims are on a back foot, and the developing Muslims are in a position where they can determine the future, at least for the next 50 to 100 years, this particular moment in South Africa. But it's not going to happen if we continue operating in silos. At some point, we need people to sit down and think and see how we can chart this forward. The time for the indigenization of Islam has come. Allah is brought to us in a platter. And we don't have, by the way, to fight or to be, hostile towards the other. But we are in a situation right now where we can determine the future trajectory of Islam in this country. I've been in several platforms where the established Muslim communities are saying, how can you help us? How can we deal with this new situation? Why? Because capital is threatened. Why? Because owners of capital are threatened, and now they want solutions to protect their capital. So you can either politically take advantage of that whilst assisting and helping Islam, or we can continue acting haphazardly as we've been doing over the past couple of weeks in terms of coordinating this extremely important, challenging time. Here's my view. My view is that we need to call upon some indaba of some sort, maybe in this masjid, sit down and talk about precisely what we want to see and how do we want to see it. Because owners of capital are on a back foot, established Muslims are on a back foot. It's our chance. Politically, you need to take advantage of the situation in terms of what you want to see. But the primary goal and objective will and must be to serve Islam. We all, we heard what Sheikh Arafat has just said, Malik Arafat has just said right now. We have to continue looking at these opportunities. The opportunities have landed. And we don't have to scream and shout and get upset. And this when you go to these platforms now. We need to come up with a package, well-thought package, on how, as indigenous Muslims, who live with other indigenous people, who are the frontiers and the buffer between the established Muslims and the indigenous Muslim, what do we want to see? How we want to see it? And how is it supposed to serve our interest? And how we're going to protect Islam in the township? There's no time to mess around right now. It's time for us to think constructively and present that package to the established Muslim to say, this is what we want. And if we don't go as a collective, again, we're going to find ourselves in a situation where some of us will be separately co-opted. We need to find a situation, and I'm not calling for a big, glossy, fleshy indaba. We need to call on our women and young people and everybody else to say, okay, this is what we want as Muslims. And because we live with the majority of these people, we know how they think, how they behave. This is the package they'll accept. And as a result, we think that this is a complexion of the new Islam. And this is how Islam should be taken forward, with the partnership of the established Muslims. And I don't think we have enough time in this regard. We need to start doing, because if you don't do that, we are likely to have a much more dangerous intra-Muslim conflict coming our way. Because I can tell you now that this current situation has opened up possible alliances between ourselves as individuals and others within our communities. And we are likely to be co-opted. And we are likely to further other people's objectives, which is, I don't think is going to benefit Islam or the unity. And we can't waste and throw away this opportunity that is coming our way. Allah has given us this opportunity. And I'm not saying this because I'm saying we must be spiteful of the established Muslims or be hostile towards established Muslims. But as people who have always been at the bottom of the food chain, for the first time, we've got something we can take to the table. Vehemently and strongly to say, this is what we bring to the table. Discuss it. Because all along, nobody took you serious. I also don't take anyone serious who does not really fit my bill of understanding what power is. But for now, we have given a social political power and a weapon that we can use, and we have it, and we bring it to the table, and we can have it discussed properly on what is it that we want. I'm not quite sure how many of you have realized that. That you're in a much, much more better position at the moment than we are as Muslims. I disagree with those that say that the developing Muslims are poorer in a much more weaker position. No, not at this moment in time. At this moment in time, we have a much, much more stronger position, and we can bring something to the table that can be listened to. But it will only take an organization, preparedness and planning amongst ourselves and leaders to deal with the situation. Because, and again, of course, I'm on record, because the established Muslims are on a back foot. It's the truth, right? That's why we've had these hundreds of statements past couple of weeks from UXA, I don't know, others doing what. Nobody knows what's going on, right? Everybody's confused. People are just don't know, it's just pulling and this, they call it scratching, slashing at straws. Nobody knows what's going on. The established Muslims, they don't know what's going on. And by the way, they haven't called on us because they still regard us as not necessarily useful. But after the failure and the deadlock, you suddenly have these doors opening up of a new possible discussion on how to lead this country forward. So we have this opportunity of alliances. We have this new weapon that we have that we can bring to the table. But at the same time, all of it must benefit Islam. It's got nothing to do with developing Muslim or black Muslims. It's got a lot to do with how we see Islam thriving in this country and who's supposed to be on the table. I mean, I was disappointed with some of these UXA statements that were given. I mean, I know they meant well, but you could see the lack of political understanding. Others will say you could see the lack of ubukasi in it. Just pure bland, all of us must just, but there's certain ways you speak to certain people in the townships. Black people smile all the time, by the way. Whenever we speak nonsense, it's just to get rid of you. And after they're doing the go and say, yeah, sure. So that patronization continues, and it continued during this moment when people are trying to solve problems. But you can't allow it to happen any further. We have to take the position and use it to our own benefit and advantage. And inshallah, Allah will help us. We have got a chance now to form new alliances, to protect our brothers who are threatened by violence in South Africa. We have a position that we can contribute towards whatever new bill is coming up in terms of determining migration and immigration in this country. We need to have a discussion, and we must be involved in that. So I think those are the three issues I think are important in closing. One is our political alliances have to change. We can't have this blanket one foreign political position towards a certain political party simply because they support Palestine. We are not about Palestine, we're about multifaceted issues. We need to define our national interest and our domestic interest so that when you go there, we have something we want. If you want to go to Al-Jamaa, we need to say, okay, we want this from you. In return, you're going to get this. But you can't just all the time, the only discussion we have is Palestine. Of course, I'm one of the supporters and activists of Palestine. I've been there, I've done many things, I've worked, I've lived, I've got friends. I've done more things in Palestine, many people in South Africa combined. But still, I do believe that we need to take a position. And our Palestinian friends will certainly understand that we're not abandoning the Palestinian cause, which is very important, let me be clear, but we need to diversify our interests. The other point which I've said is also identify that you are going to be called upon as a leader. You're going to be called upon by gays, drug addicts, murderers, homosexuals. They're all going to, drunkards, they're all going to want your leadership. What are you going to do? We see what's happening with Zuhran Mamdani, as I've said. We've seen what's happening with, Yusuf Qasim. We've seen what's happening with a lot of other people. What are we going to do? What's our preparedness for this new leadership that's coming our way? Because of our good conduct. And as we continue interacting in the townships, by the way, it's going to come more and more. Are we ready for it? Imam, are you preparing us for this new leadership that is diverse, multicultural, non-cultural, with diverse interests? Are we preparing our people for that leadership, or only preparing it for Jannah? Are we preparing them to lead, as is the case at the moment? Are we ready for it? That's the second point I talked about. This intra-Muslim position that we find ourselves, that the established Muslims are on a back foot. And this is the moment for us to secure the seat on the table. We're no longer demanding it, by the way. It's there, it's open. But when we take it, how are we going to deal with it and what we do? So this discussion henceforth must go on. And the cultural challenges that our people are facing, and again, this is an emphasis. 70% in this room, all of us, can walk anywhere at the moment in the township without a threat. But our sisters can't, because we've insisted on them to have a certain gap that has got nothing to do with hijab. Now, I'm not saying people must throw hijab, but I'm saying let us redefine what hijab is, and to what extent does it conflict with our aunties and my aunts and my cousins who are sitting in the township. I left at the moment, who are also looking like Muslims. They're just not wearing the hijab in an oriental manner. So this new challenge and dangers that our sisters are facing, by the way, I'm not quite sure how many of you are following up reports. The people that have been targeted now, the majority of them, because they feel that they can go to clip down, they're South Africans, they don't anticipate any pushback, has been our own sisters, who are now harassed at every second spot they go to because they think they are something else. So I'm saying let us redefine, and I'm not saying let us compromise on hijab, but maybe we should think about reverting into what hijab is from where we come from, because it's always been hijab. My grandmother has always been in a hijab. Didn't mean that, she didn't put a doek like this, then she was no longer in hijab. She still put it in a different way, but it was hijab. So these are important issues that I think this dialogue should tackle. And I don't think anyone should feel offended, or we are trying to carve a new position as Muslims, and we're trying to carve a new social, political, and cultural reality and inclusion within our society as a Muslim. And I think that's where I'll leave it. Shukran for the invitation. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.